The monstrous dribbler Bachira Meguru goes one-on-one against the copycat of Blue Lock Reo Mikage in a fight that has the word limitless written all over it. And recently, with both players shining and dominating in the U20 World Cups, it has never been more fitting for us to look at their stats, abilities and explore their best feats to determine who is the most limitless player in Blue Lock. Reo Mikage, or should I say versatility personified. Not a singular player in the show could be put in any position on the pitch and do well as much as Reo, and that by definition makes Reo so unique, but at the same time it makes him the most versatile player in the show. And obviously this versatility stems from his weapons. However, interestingly enough, his physicality also plays a huge role in his versatility. In fact, this physicality is at the core of his playing style. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about Reo's very special physicality. You see, whenever I talk about physicality and whenever I say a player is absurdly OP in this aspect, it usually involves them being dominant in a certain aspect, like Chigiri and Loki when it comes to speed, or sometimes the player is dominant in two areas, like Shido when it comes to agility and his jumping ability. However, the case with Reo is rather special, because much like Ren and Sai, he is a very well-rounded player, which means even though he doesn't excel, or I should say he doesn't break the mold completely in any particular area to his physicality, but at the same time he is actually great in all aspects. And I think what sets him apart from the Itoshi brothers is actually the way he takes this ability to the extreme, because unlike Sai or Ren, Reo's mastery over all the physical aspects is just slightly below exceptional, meaning he might not be the fastest, the strongest, or the one who can jump the highest. However, he is very close to the top in all of those aspects. In fact, even special cases like agility. He is no Lorenzo, Nagi or Shido, however he is very agile and he too can do a lot of crazy stunts. And in fact, this ability of his to pull off insane stunts is actually a weapon of his. And in fact, it is the one at the core of his existence on the pitch. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about his abilities and weapons. And for Reo actually, we only have two weapons, which I know might sound crazy, but judging by how absurd one weapon is, he doesn't really need any other weapons. Of course, I'm talking about his chameleon style, and just how absurdly versatile that weapon is. However, before we dive deeper into it, I actually want to talk about the second weapon first. That way we can get it out of the way and dedicate the remaining of the portion to Reo's copying ability. And of course, the second weapon I'm talking about is Metavision. Now, in case you don't know what Metavision is, it is an ability where the player utilizes his peripheral vision to widen his field of perception and take in all the information he could gather. Furthermore, the player shakes his head in all directions to give himself a 360 plane of view, making the player seem as if he can see everything happening around him. In a sense, Metavision gives the player a bird's eye view of everything happening around him, which again, by just describing it, you can tell how absurd this power is, and you can tell that almost any player that possesses this ocular ability is actually an insane player. As for where Reo's Metavision stands, I feel like it is a hit or miss. You see, unlike almost any player with Metavision in Blue Lock, Reo remains one of only two guys who unlocked Metavision subconsciously and then kept on using it, which inherently means that his Metavision isn't as potent as say Isagi or Kaiser. However, I honestly don't think that's the only issue here, because Karasu is the second player who unlocked it subconsciously, and his Metavision is definitely on Char's, Kaiser and Isagi's level, meaning there must be something going on with Reo, and I feel like the reason his Metavision suffered a lot is because of his fixation on Nagi, and I feel like Hiyori is actually the perfect example of the opposite of this. You see, despite him being a midfielder who is in debt to Isagi, Hiyori still has no issue to deliver the pass to any striker worthy of scoring, and so Reo being focused too much on Nagi really hurt his Metavision. However, now that Nagi has been eliminated, I feel like we could see the true level of Reo's Metavision, which I wouldn't assume for it to be on Isagi, Kaiser and Karasu's level, but I would say it is on Hiyori and Aiko's level. Not the best really, but still very high. And FYI, when I say it like this, I don't mean that Reo, Hiyori and Aiko's Metavisions are weak. I'm just saying that they are not the best we've seen and nothing more to this. However, enough about Metavision, enough about his secondary weapon. Let's actually get to the meat of Ryo's playing style, which is, as I said before, is his copying ability, or in better words, Ryo's chameleon style. A weapon that is born of his mastery of all the physical aspects. But also, I feel like this weapon wouldn't be a thing if it wasn't for Ryo's big brain. As you all know, he is one of the smartest players in the show. In any case, however, in this style and while utilizing this copying weapon, Ryo unleashes his creativity and his physical prowess, allowing him, much like the name suggests, to copy almost any technique he sees, no matter how hard, how complicated, or even how taxing it is on the body. After just witnessing it once, Ryo can very easily copy it. And actually here I want to talk about how important his training in the Neo Egoist League was for this weapon specifically. You see, even though it was completely random, Ryo choosing Manshine might have been the best thing that happened to him. And I know it is the worst team in the Neo Egoist League, but it had the best master who gave everything to his youngs. And for Ryo's case specifically, him training Ender Prince gave him an insane physique, which further improved his copying ability. Because you see, when it comes to the chameleon style, only two things matter. First is actually creativity and Ryo's ability to be imaginative. And next, and of course, is his physical prowess. And so by training Ender, the most perfect player in the show, Ryo unintentionally enhanced his strongest weapon insanely. And in fact, when I say that this is Ryo's strongest weapon, I actually mean the chameleon style is actually the strongest weapon in Blue Lock, being only rivaled by special weapons like adaptability or unpredictability. Which honestly is a head scratcher for me. A guy with this much talent, a guy with the best weapon there is so fixated on Nagi for no apparent reason. Sure, Nagi's plays are mesmerizing, but like we've seen, Ryo can copy them still. And so I never really understood why Ryo went back into cherishing Nagi that much. I mean, I get it at first because Nagi was just insane, but after the second and third selection and after the U20 game, I feel like Ryo could copy any technique no matter how complex. In fact, even Nagi's insane and crazy stunts can be copied by Ryo no issue, and so I really do not understand his fixation on Nagi. In any case, however, I hope by just talking about it like this, I have delivered the message of how absurd this weapon is and why Ryo doesn't really need any other weapon with the exception to Metavision. You see, if Ryo needs shooting, he can copy almost any shot he sees, like we've seen him do with Yuki and Chigiri's shots. Furthermore, if he needs techniques for dueling both on ground and in the air, he can very easily copy the likes of Aiku, Rin, and Sai. Hell, as I said, even if Ryo needs insane techniques that fit with specific situations, he can copy the crazy stunts pulled off by the other players, like we've seen him do with Otoya's off-the-ball plays and with Nagi's insane techniques. However, this specifically leads us to talk about how Ryo evolved his chameleon style. You see, at first, Ryo just copied random moves here and there. However, moving into the NEL, Ryo discovered that there is no limitation on how much he can copy. The only thing keeping him from copying anything is his own imagination. And so what Ryo started to do is, instead of just copying random techniques, is actually to copy an entire playing style. In fact, not only one playing style, but rather Ryo can even mix and match different playing styles in order to result in a very formidable opponent. We've seen him do it in the Bastard game by copying both Rin and Sai. And then, and more impressively, we've seen him do it against FC Barca when he copied both Otoya and Nagi's playing style. However, he then blew everything out of proportion in the U20 World Cups, where he did not just copy one playing style or two, but rather the guy was just pulling off random playing styles here and there, and whatever works for any situation, Ryo would copy and use. Which we actually gotta thank Ego for that, because he is the one who opened Ryo's eyes of the possibility of copying every insane player in Blue Lock, not necessarily just focusing on one or two playing styles like he used to before. And so with that, Ryo really became the definition of unlimited in that game. Not only he is the most versatile, and not only does he have the strongest weapon in Blue Lock, he also is very unlimited in his playing style, which makes defending against him really hard for the enemy team. However, wait a second, if Ryo is this busted, if Ryo is this OP, why isn't he playing on the same level as Isigi, Rin, and Kaiser? Well, that boils down to one thing, which is mentality. You see, there is a reason why Noah completely destroyed Chris Prince in the Manshine City game, despite Prince being the most overpowered and the most threatening player ever. And that simply boiled down to mentality. While Prince was focused on shining and on showing off, Noah was actually focused on victory. And so every time Prince was about to do something, Noah would come from behind, completely surprising him. And in fact, I think the writer shown us that matchup specifically before the matchup against Snuffy, just to show us how important mentality is. And I mean, that's the case with Ryo. As I said earlier, I don't really understand his fixation on Nagi. It did nothing but hurt both him and Sekiro. In fact, it even led to the latter being eliminated. However, even though he survived, I don't think Ryo was better off, as being fixated on anything but your own craft is actually just deadly in Blue Lock. And actually, to drive this point home, I found it very fitting that the only U20 player that was complimented by Noah was actually Baro. In fact, even Isigi and his insane plays weren't really impressive to Noah because the latter did not have his mind right. Isigi was fanboying Noah too much, and that's why he was impressed by Baro when the latter challenged Snuffy, because to him, if Baro is on the right mentality, he will stop at nothing until he becomes the king of Blue Lock. And then Noah only took Isigi seriously when the latter showed seeds of great mentality, when the latter threw his fixations on Akaza, Rin and Noah. And so, as you can see, mentality is such an important aspect of Blue Lock. And Ryo, despite being so busted and despite having the strongest weapon in Blue Lock, is actually failing because of his weak mentality. However, and again, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Now that Nagi actually was eliminated, I feel like Ryo could do something. And actually, once he fixes his mentality, I have no doubt that there will be no other player that would be as busted and as overpowered as Ryo, because honestly his chameleon style has near infinite potential and remains Ryo's ultimate weapon that makes him the most versatile and probably in the future the most dominant player. However, can the chameleon actually slay the monster? Bachira Meguru, the unlimited dribbler of Blue Lock. A player that whenever I see, I always think of just one thing. He is the definition of freedom. As you see, with the exception to Levi, I don't think there is a player on Blue Lock that is more freedom type than Bachira Meguru. And actually, this freedom specifically is at the core of his playing style. However, first, let's get the boring stuff out of the way and talk about his physicality. Which I gotta say, he is just another Isigi. Nothing special here and nothing to be seen. He is an average Joe and he is happy about it. And so let's skip talking about this and move to the more important stuff, his abilities and weapons. Now, funny enough, much like Ryo, Bachira also only possesses two weapons. One that is his main weapon and it is at the core of his playing style, and the other is an additive weapon that Bachira acquired throughout the years. And in fact, we are going to start with it. And here, I'm talking of course about his passing ability. Now, I gotta issue an apology. In my top passers videos, I actually placed Bachira too low, because you see, I feel like Bachira has one of the best passing abilities we've seen in Blue Lock if we exclude the attacking midfielders that we've seen. If we exclude Ness, Charles, Sai and Hiyori, Bachira is definitely one of the best passers in Blue Lock. However, what is this passing ability of his is all about? You see, before awakening in the second selection, Bachira was always on the lookout of a monstrous player, and of course he met it through Isigi and Ren. And so at the time, and because his ego did not flourish yet, his instincts led him to be a midfielder for the two strikers. And for that reason, and also because of his second weapon, Bachira found himself in the position of delivering critical passes. And so, and because he is a genius like that, Bachira developed an insane passing ability, which, as I said, it might not be on the highest of calibers, but for the regular players, it is actually one of the best. However, enough yapping about his stupid passing ability, and let's actually move to the main event of his abilities and weapons, which is of course his dribbling ability. Now, undoubtedly, Bachira has one of the best, if not the best dribbling ability in the U20 category. I mean, when it comes to this specifically, and when looking at the stats, he was the highest in the Neo Egoist League. And then of course, we've seen him pull off insane stunts and cement that he is one of the best dribblers. Now, what I find to be very interesting about Bachira when it comes to his dribbling is the fact that because he is a genius and because he is a freedom type of a player, you would think his dribbling should be an active style dribbling, which definitely was for the most part of Blue Lock. However, after training under Levy, Bachira now can also incorporate reactive dribbling moves into his assets, making him the most complete dribbler in the U20 category hands down. Now, that's what makes his dribbling very special. However, what makes it OP actually has nothing to do with his footwork. In fact, it's all in his head. You see, being one of the most extreme geniuses in Blue Lock, Bachira's imagination knows no bound, and his ability to mutate and pull off some insane stunts all of a sudden is honestly unmatched. Maybe only Rin among the geniuses is on this level. There is literally no telling to what Bachira is about to do, because simply put, how do you deal with an unlimited monster like him? Well, there was actually a play, which is actually a simple fact. Any player, no matter how professional and oppressive they are, have a rhythm to their dribbling, and so Bachira's choke point was always his rhythms. However, I feel like that was before training under Levy. For sure, we've seen the same problem happen against Bastard, where Ness was able to figure out Bachira's rhythm. However, after that game, and seeing how he performed against Manshine City, I can tell that Bachira introduced a lot of varying rhythms to his dribbling. That way, not only can he be unlimited in his dribbling moves, but also be unlimited in his dribbling rhythms, making him, as I said, an unlimited beast on the pitch. There is literally no telling to what Bachira is about to do. And then when you couple this with his very special mentality, which forces him to go for insane plays that push his imagination further, Bachira truly is an unlimited beast that knows no bounds. He keeps on growing, he keeps on dribbling, and he keeps on putting people to shame. However, when it comes to defending against dribblers, there is another way onto how to stop them beyond just their dribbling rhythm, which is actually to watch out for their upper body. You see, typically it's the upper body that gives off the dribbling. It is the upper body that notifies the defender of what the player is trying to do. However, Bachira has the solution to this weakness that plagues almost any dribbler, which is of course the Jenga technique that he learned from Lavinio. And in fact, this technique specifically is the one that made him a reactive type of a dribbler, in addition to also being active dribbling style. As for what the Jenga entails, it simply separates the body from the footwork. You see, while doing his moves and when he is trying to beat a tough opponent, Bachira's upper body remains completely still, while his footwork go crazy on the defender, confusing him completely and actually causing his dribbling to be more successful than not. And in fact, another insane dribbler, Don Lorenzo, utilizes this technique specifically, even if it comes under a different name, which is the zombie steps. However, the case for Lorenzo is very special. His upper body is detached from his footwork not because he controls it, but it is due to his weird body. However, for Bachira, he does it completely consciously, resulting in him being dubbed by the community the unlimited dribbler of Blue Lock. However, can the master of dribbling actually beat the copycat of Blue Lock? For how this matchup would go, I honestly find it one of the most interesting, most intriguing matchups we've seen on the channel as of yet, specifically due to the limitless nature of this matchup. Both players' playing styles know no bounds and are only limited by their own imagination, which is funny because they are one of the most creative players in Blue Lock. However, how does one limitless fare against another? Well, my first thought is that Rio definitely wins. Whatever Bachira pulls off, Rio can copy. However, Rio can still do a plethora of things that are way beyond Bachira's reach. And I mean, even in passing, which is Bachira's second strongest weapon, Rio can copy more absurd and more insane passes from the likes of Ness, Charles or Sai. And so Rio trumps him, right? Well, not quite. I feel like on paper Rio is definitely better because of his chameleon style. However, as it stands, his mentality is really shaky and there is no telling of where he stands. Furthermore, Rio's copying style is only 99% and it's not actually the real deal, which in the highest of levels it shows, much like it happened with Gagamaru in the Manshine City game. However, there is another aspect to look at when it comes to this matchup. You see, even though I keep saying that Rio is limitless, he is bound by his ability to copy, and even though that might seem as unlimited, he is not on the level of Bachira when it comes to this point specifically. What I am trying to say is that Bachira's nature is very limitless and there is no telling of what moves he will use, and Rio will end up only playing the catch-up game. And in this case specifically, Bachira's ability to score is undeniably one of the best, and we are yet to see Rio on that level of threat consistently. And so for that reason, if I was a coach and I had to choose between Bachira and Ryo, I would definitely choose Bachira. However, I feel like if Ryo fixes his mentality in the future, I definitely see him beating Bachira. In fact, I definitely see him beating anyone in Blue Lock. However, that's all I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, thank you for watching.